Hello everyone, welcome to my Ni no Kuni Wrath of the White Witch review video. First of all, spoiler alert, because this review will have spoilers, so if you're looking for a spoiler-free review, this is not it. I'm going to start with a short description of the game, followed by pros, neutrals, and cons as I see them. Without further ado, let's start with a short description. Ni no Kuni Wrath of the White Witch is a game about a young boy called Oliver, whose mother dies in an accident, and naturally, he becomes very sad. And his tears awaken a doll that was actually a fairy named Mr. Drippy. So tears free Mr. Drippy from his curse, from being a doll, and they go on an adventure together to Drippy's world in the hopes of saving Oliver's mother. Long story short, people over there have soulmates with people over here, or over in Oliver's world. I'm gonna say over here, it's shorter. And what happens on one side affects the other. So Mr. Drippy realizes that Oliver's mom is a spitting image of Alicia, who was a great sage who tried to defeat Shadar, the big bad, one of the big bads, or almost the big bad. And was captured by him, supposedly captured. So Mr. Drippy hopes that by defeating Shadar and saving Alicia, Oliver's mom will return. That's the story in a nutshell. So let's start with the pros. Now, I'm gonna start by saying that Ni no Kuni Wrath of the White Witch is actually one of my favorite games of all time. And one of the main reasons is the first pro, which is the incredible amount of detail and care that went into making this game. In most games you'll have like some random items that explain the lore, or maybe some NPCs that explain the lore. In Ni no Kuni Wrath of the White Witch, you instead have a book called The Wizard's Companion that just has everything. And I do mean everything. Like, it explains the wizard wars that happened before Oliver's time. I think like a century before Oliver's time. They detail each spell, each familiar that you encounter. I'll get to familiars in a bit. And just detail everything about the world. And this book, actually in the original game, the book was an actual physical, tangible book that came with the game. I tried to look up how much to get my hands on a book. It's too expensive in my opinion, almost as much as the actual game. But it is a work of art. It's dedication to the game on a level that I rarely see. It's like if they did just like 1% of Tolkien, which is still a lot more than 99% of everybody. You know, it's like they wrote the book first and then decided, hey, you know what, since we spent all this time writing the book, we may as well just make a game while we're at it. So yeah, that's how I feel about it. So the book isn't the only thing that's heavily detailed. Besides the book, you have an alphabet. It's in the book, but still. It's an alphabet used by an ancient civilization, you know, the typical precursors that are more advanced than anything that comes after because reasons. And it's a one-to-one replacement with the English alphabet. More or less, there are some letters that don't exist, or they're all the same letter, and it's read from right to left. There's that as well. Then you have the character roster, so these NPCs, well, most of them are just NPCs, you know, they're villagers who say the same thing over and over again, or just people who have a quest for you. But the main guys are fleshed out characters, fully fleshed out characters with their own backstory and motivations. Of course, they all align perfectly with Oliver, and Oliver's, sorry. And there are a few instances where I think they went a little bit too far. Like, okay, Oliver is a powerful wizard, but he is still a child. So it does seem a bit weird that a fully grown man, one of the main characters called Swain, just goes along with whatever Oliver says. Oliver and of course Esther, the other main character, who is also a child. And you know, that part is a bit weird, but overall I think the characters are very well written, and it's definitely not something you see every day. They usually kind of skimp out on the NPCs. You know, they're there to support you, and that's it. They don't have anything else going on. Swain, for instance, has a very intricate backstory. He's not just loyal to Oliver, he does have his own agenda that he hopes to accomplish by assisting Oliver. It's not nefarious in any way, but it is there, and it gives the character some additional depth. Now, I summarized the story a bit, but it doesn't quite do it justice. So, during the story, the story deals with some adult themes, despite the game being for children, as is the example of how to deal with death. It's not something that is brought up to children a lot. In fact, it's usually avoided. But the game does it well, in my opinion, because at a certain point you realize, and again, I just want to make sure that nobody skipped the initial spoiler warning. This is going to be heavy spoilers. You realize that Alicia is actually Oliver's mother. She traveled to the other world and through time so that she could give birth to Oliver, who became the savior of her world, according to the prophecy, yada yada. You know, the usual prophecies. And so she's not coming back. She's dead, and she's staying that way. There is no soulmate on her side, or on Mr. Drippy's side. She's just gone forever. Now, of course, this is a blow for Oliver, who goes into a coma or something. I'm not quite sure. And eventually is rescued by another character named P, who, that's P-E-A, obviously. So he's rescued by a character named P. She goes into his mind, where he's living out a fantasy with his mom. You know, it's a coma fantasy, you know, the usual. And tells him, you know, your life wasn't, or your quest wasn't irrelevant just because it couldn't be accomplished. You helped a lot of people along the way, and that's important. And I think that's a great message for everyone, not just children. That just because what you set out to do was impossible doesn't mean you failed. Because along the way, you made choices, and hopefully those choices made the world a better place. And again, I think that's an important message. Of course, it wouldn't be a story without... well, it wouldn't be a relatively modern story without some plot twists. The plot twist, the one that I mentioned, that Alicia was actually Oliver's mom. There are a few more plot twists. For instance, Shadar, who is the White Witch's lieutenant, sorta. He's her main guy. He was actually originally, at least from what I understood, he was actually supposed to become the savior, or more or less, because you find out that he actually saved Oliver's mom from being executed by because she was the daughter of some great sage or whatever, and so they wanted to kill her. And because he saved her, they burned down his entire village. So he became desperate and turned to evil when the White Witch came knocking. The White Witch herself is always surrounded by her council and a bird called, I think, Apis. And then you find out that none of it's real. Her power is just so strong that it brought back her memories. And of course, at the end, when the Zodiarchy, that's the culmination, the meshing, if you will, of all the 12 zodiacs, well, 11. One of them is actually her father. They split from her power, so they're no longer bound to her, and become their own sentient being called the Zodiarchy. So yeah, that's something you don't really expect. Hell, I didn't remember it, so when it happened to me, it was a surprise, even though I'd already played through the game once, because I just straight up forgotten, and I did not expect it at all. So, you know, the story has some good plot twists, has a good message, and it deals with adult themes in a way that is, well, that is actually very grown up, if you will, despite being for children. Now, of course, the game has magic. I'm a magic fan, so I gotta talk about the way magic works here. Well, the way magic works is, of course, you have MP, so it's MP, mana, FP, whatever you want to call it. And you spend it by casting spells. The spells are many. There are just a ton of spells, pages of spells. Each page is actually just one spell, I think. Well, regardless, it's still a lot of spells that you can learn. Now, unfortunately, we're gonna have a bit of a con bleeding through here. Not all of them are usable. One of them is just usable once. Actually, I think a few of them are only usable once and only to solve a few quests. So it feels a bit of like a bit of a waste to have a book just filled with spells and lore and stuff, and then out of all the spells you have a few combat spells, and that's pretty much it. Well, no, that's not pretty much it. There are some spells that you can use called everyday spells, but as I said, a lot of them won't be usable ever, and some of them will only be usable once to solve a quest. So that's a bit of a letdown. But of the ones that you can use, they are very, very varied. So you have, of course, your Fireball. That's Magic 101. Every Magic game I've ever seen has a Fireball. It's the most basic of spells. You have an Icicle that you can summon, which deals damage. You have healing spells, of course. Again, very common. You have spells that can summon a thunderstorm. You have spells that can summon a guardian that you defeated, and then the guardian or a boss, and then that boss will use its most powerful attack and deal a lot of damage to one or more characters. It depends. So, you know, just a great variety of spells. Now, familiars, of course, I mentioned before the familiars, which I'll describe now. Familiars are, according to the lore, actual tangible representations of the wizard's soul. The second spell you cast is called Form Familiar, and it is intended to create a familiar that is the representation of your soul. And so you get a Mite. That's M-I-T-E. So because they are actually a part of you, when they take damage, you take damage. And vice versa, of course. So you share an HP bar and an MP bar because you are essentially the same being. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention back when I was talking about the spells. Each spell has a rune that Oliver draws to cast the spell. As I understand it, in the original game you would actually draw the runes on the Nintendo DS's second screen. Although I'm not sure if that was just a rumor or something. Because that is what I heard, but I didn't really do my research. So, you know, just take that with a grain of salt. Anyway, the runes are fairly, how would I put this, consistent, if you will. So, for instance, there are three spells that are related to each other. You got Mornstar, Evenstar, and Astra. And their runes are similar. They're not identical, but they are similar to each other. So Mornstar deals a lot of light damage to one target. Evenstar deals a lot of dark damage to all targets. And Astra deals light damage to all targets. It's the most powerful spell in the game, with an accompanying high MP cost. So these runes here are all related, or rather the spells are all related to each other. And so the runes are also similar to each other. Furthermore, some runes also just seem to describe what the spell is. Gateway, for instance, you have the drawing of a gateway. It looks like an omega symbol, but if you just imagine a gateway, an archway, it would be more or less like this, with, of course, the line down the middle representing the separation between the doors. Levitate, which just shows someone's feet hovering off the ground. The broom spell, I think it's called Broom actually. Oh, and it's just a broom, and just all the spells are like that. Like the take heart and give heart, it's very, all very consistent, if you will. So as I was saying regarding familiars, you share HP and MP. You can also tame them in the wild. Esther is actually the one who tames them. So you defeat them, sometimes they stick around, and then if you switch to Esther, you can have her serenade the monster, and it becomes a familiar for you to use. Familiars, of course, have their own stats, their stat growth, they have abilities called tricks. And just, it's basically Pokemon if everybody had the same HP bar. That's the best way, I think, to summarize it. Oh, and of course, if Ash could use magic. So, talk about the familiars, the spells, the story, the plot twists, and the level of detail that went into the game. Detail and care. So, I think now is the time to go into the neutrals. Ni no Kuni features a combat system that seems to be a hybrid of real-time and turn-based action. So everything you do is in real time, but then every action has a cooldown. And of course the cooldown is proportional to how powerful the action was. So Astra, for instance, has of course a big wind-up time, I think like 6 seconds or something. And the spell action is locked for some time. On the other hand, if you just use what is it, healing hand? No, it's not. It's not healing hand. It's the whichever one is the weaker healing spell. If you use it, the cooldown is basically non-existent. It's about the time it'll take you to swap over to the spell tab. So, oh, and in a truly incredible turn of events, if you will, enemies also play by the same rules. So, if you see an enemy attack, it will attack and then go into a cooldown for the attack interaction, and that's when you should attack. Unless you're me and you're impatient and you just go at it and die. Of course, oh, right, all actions have animations that must play out before the action is actually performed. And that includes using items, which is very reminiscent of Dark Souls. I was actually surprised by how similar to Souls-like Ni no Kuni actually is. Because of the fact that each action has a cooldown, has an animation that must fully play out before the action is completed. and before the effects are actually felt. So that was actually very interesting for me to note. Now, you can also try to escape from battles. Sometimes you will succeed, sometimes you won't. I think these operate on the same logic that if you're a lot more powerful than the enemies, you escape more often than not, which seems contradictory to me. But regardless, if you try to escape and you fail, it leaves your team vulnerable to attack, which again feels like something a Dark Souls game would do if the combat worked like this. I know I keep drawing parallels to Dark Souls, which seems absurd given the different tones of the games, but trust me, in terms of some mechanics being heavily punishing, they are actually fairly similar. Now, there are a few cons. They are mostly regarding the combat system, so I'll try to be succinct about this, because otherwise this review is going to be an hour long or something. So yeah, let's start with healing, or just actions in general. So, interactions are not cancelled if they are no longer possible. So say you tried to heal someone, but they passed out, they were knocked unconscious. You can no longer heal them. You need to use a special item to get them up from the unconscious state, because, you know, that's how it works in video games. However, the action will still be performed, fail, and you will have a cooldown, and of course lose either the item associated with it or the MP associated with it. Now, the fact that familiars share HP and MP is, in my opinion, a bit... I mean, it makes sense from a lore perspective, but in terms of actual gameplay, it doesn't feel all that great. The worst part is that they don't share levels. So you can be level, I don't know, 100, but I don't actually know what the max level is, so I'm just saying a number. But then your familiar might be just level 13 or something. Oh, and of course, when you capture a familiar, you don't actually keep the level that they are at. Or they don't keep the level that they are at. Their level goes down, sometimes to level 1, sometimes a bit higher, but they are reset to a default state. Not actually sure what the formula here is, but they are reset. Right, and so familiars don't evolve like in Pokemon. They go through a metamorphosis for which you need to feed them a specific item. Upon doing so, their level is reset to level 1. And again, I have no idea why. It's, in my opinion, a very, very bad design choice. That's just how I feel. Now, there is an issue of you being under-leveled if you don't grind enough. And this is because you can't know the levels of your opponents. So if you lose to a boss, you won't know if that boss is level 50 or level 5, and so you can't know when you should, or to which point, how much you should grind. There's just no frame of reference. You can look up guides, you can look up other people's opinions, but in the end, all you have to go on is just speculation from other players. Now, there is no easy way to restore either HP or MP besides items. There is a spell that you can use that can technically restore MP and HP separately, but it's a random spell. It's called Fortune's Fool, and it is literally a roll of the dice. So you could just as easily just drop a boulder on all the enemies, and by boulder I mean a tiny pebble that deals 1 damage. You could curse your own team with random status effects, including curse. You could heal your team for a modest amount of HP, or restore their MP, or just cause lightning bolts to fall on all the enemies. There is no way to predict what the outcome is going to be, hence the name of the spell, Fortune's Fool. Of course, if you're underleveled and don't realize it, no MP essentially means no damage, and no damage means bye-bye. Okay, so moving on. There are these things called glims, which are just balls. It's a fancy term for balls, apparently. Some are blue, some are green, and one is golden. Green restore HP, blue restore MP, and golden unlock a special attack that is unique to each character. Now the golden ball attack, the gold glim attack, sorry, is, as I said, unique for each character. So no matter sorry, no matter how many you pick up, no matter when you pick them up, no matter who you are facing, you will always use the exact same attack. So that's that could be a bit of an issue if, for instance, you accidentally pick one up with Oliver, who has a fireball attack, giant fireball attack, and you're facing an enemy that is resistant to fire. Or if you want to deal some damage, but then whoever picks it up has an attack that heals everybody or removes status effects or something. Right, so moving on. As a general rule, there is a severe offset in cost to usefulness ratio, if you will. For instance, a strong coffee costs 4 times as much as iced coffee, but it only restores 3 times the MP. So in terms of what's the money called? Glimmer, I think. That sounds about right. Whatever the money is called. In terms of cost to MP restoration, you would be better off just using 3 iced coffees. Sure, you could argue that one is a single-use item, or rather, you only need to use 1 of the strong coffee as opposed to 3 of the iced coffees, but then you have to take into account one thing. The strong coffee will result in a longer cooldown than the iced coffee by default, just because it is better, or restores more. So what happens is that you end up with an item that is technically better, but in practice it's just not worth it. In fact, Fireball is often more efficient in terms of MP to damage than most other spells. However, it should be said that other spells have some abilities that Fireball does not. Pulse, for instance, can knock down most enemies. Not all of them, but most. Or at least knock them back a bit and make them rethink their life choices. So enemies have unlimited MP. This is common in video games, but it annoys me. I think AI should play by the same rules as the player. During combat, Mr. Drippy occasionally throws some glims, but they are almost always thrown toward the player. Toward the enemy, instead of toward the player, which was really annoying. So those are the issues with combat. Next, we have excuse me. We have an issue with spells used for progression. See, spells used for progression are spells that you need to use in specific instances in order to progress. Simple, right? However, these spells cost MP even outside of combat. So, for instance, the bridge spell, which you need to use, this is not optional, you absolutely need to use this spell to progress in certain areas. You need to have, I think, 5 MP, which doesn't sound like much, but when you've been using spells because it's the only thing that actually deals damage, because you have no idea how underleveled you are, and you're running low on MP, the last thing you want is to spend 5 MP on a spell that only serves so you can move on. And it should be noted that the spell has no use in combat, so it is literally just to create bridges. So there's no reason why it should cost MP. That's just how I feel about it. Now, finally, the last con. You can't save in dungeons, or as the game calls them, dangerous areas. Now, because it is easy to die, because you don't know what level the enemies are, and because the waste stones, which are the only way to save in the dungeon, are far and few between, you can potentially lose a lot of progress because you just don't know how powerful the enemies are until one of them actually comes at you and kicks your ass. So it's very easy to just lose a ton of time because you can't save. So those are the that's the last of the cons. So again, pros: a great amount of detail and care. There's a good story that deals with adult themes in an adult way, even though the game is for children, and great spell variety and good NPCs. Neutrals: the combat system, which is unique out of all the games I've played, the hybrid real-time / turn-based approach, which can be good, but can also be bad. It depends on which aspect you're looking at. Cons: mostly the combat system being, let's say, unintuitive, and the familiar system also being unintuitive. And of course the fact that items and spells don't really scale their MP cost and usefulness at the same rate, making it so more expensive spells and items are actually worse in practice when you use them compared to the cheaper ones. Overall, despite the problems with the combat system, which can be solved mostly if you just overlevel, there are these creatures called tokos, which just give you a lot of XP, like too much. I think it's like 10 times what other enemies of similar level give you. So yeah, besides the combat systems, I think Ni no Kuni is a very, very solid game. I would give it an 8.5 out of 10. Actually, let's make it... yeah, 8.5 out of 10. Now, 0.5 if they either fully detached the familiars from characters, so you would no longer take damage when one of your familiars takes damage, and they would have their own MP pool and whatnot, or fully integrated them so that your familiar is at the same level you are. You know, go all the way, one way or another. Don't do this halfway thing that doesn't really work, in my opinion. And of course, one full point if the combat system were fixed. So that would both those things together would make Ni no Kuni, in my opinion, a perfect 10 out of 10 video game. And I'm not joking. This is really a great game. If you haven't played it, I definitely think you should. So, you know, that's a recommendation from me, Orion. For anyone who hasn't played it, to just go at it and play it. It and the sequel. So, that is the end of my Ni no Kuni Wrath of the White Witch review. As always, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you again next time.